the Hastings-on-Hudson waterfront. So beautiful, so inviting, so frustrating. You see, I would love nothing more than to tell you this is what the waterfront looks like today. But these are just mere sketches, dreams. Some would say pipe dreams. Others would call it hope for the future. It's an old issue for the people of this town, but one we must address if we ever dare to live this dream of reclaiming 28 acres of prime waterfront property on the majestic Hudson River just a stone's throw from the greatest city in the world. The problem, as it stands now, and as it has stood for the past 30 years this is what the vast majority of the Hastings waterfront actually looks like. Barren, desolate, contaminated, rendering it not only useless for man and beast alike, but downright deadly. So, how did it get contaminated in the first place? Excellent question, but as most complicated things unravel many more questions, we'll try to keep this simple. Anaconda, the serpent within. A look at PCBs in the Hastings-Hudson River. So, why did I choose this subject? Well, for one, I grew up in this town, and I've always known it to be a place I care a great deal about. Two, Anaconda left when I was just a kid, right about the time that we discovered the health risks surrounding PCBs, and a lot of good people were put out of work. It's been abandoned ever since. Three, the sheer ridiculousness of having almost 30 acres of prime riverfront real estate with New York City visible in the background takes us to a new level of irony. And four, the dreams. The good people of Hastings have been discussing what to do with this space for the better part of 40 years. And none of it has been able to happen due to the cost of three little letters, PCB. And I find that absolutely criminal. So, what the hell is a PCB, and why don't we use them anymore? Well, PCB stands for polychlorinated biphenyl. It's actually a man-made organic chemical, which coincidentally is made from chlorine, which you may remember comes from the sodium chloride in sea salt. See, Doc, I was paying attention. It's also a group of toxic persistent chemicals, which means it lasts in the soil and the water for a really, really long time. It was primarily used as insulation for its fire retardant and water resistant properties, and we have to note that it was also banned in 1979 because it was found to be way too dangerous and toxic, and people were getting really sick. Put it all together, and you get a black, waxy solid that was primarily used by heavy industry for its water-resistant and flame-retardant properties. Which brings us to why it came to be in this sleepy little village of Hastings-on-Hudson in the first place. First, a little history. The Hastings waterfront has been used by heavy industry for the better part of the last 165 years. Everything from the Hudson River Steam Sugar Refinery in 1849 to the Hastings Pavement Company in 1875, who, by the way, supplied pavers to help build Central Park. To the National Conduit and Cable Company in 1891, who made weapons for the Army, and eventually in 1928, the Anaconda Wire and Cable Company purchased most of the land along the river and kept the cable industry intact for the better part of the next 50 years. They were to significantly help the World War II effort by supplying, now pay attention kids, water-resistant, flame-retardant cables to the Navy for submarine wiring. Yep, you guessed it, and they created a lot of PCBs along the way. One of the major problems was that all this industry happened in the exact same spot along the river, 28 acres, and a lot of the waste byproduct created was absorbed by that land, and a lot of it migrated directly into the Hudson River as well. So even though Anaconda and its predecessors helped families build homes, raise children, and create life, the price we paid was a high one. Some paid with their lives. Anaconda would eventually close its doors in the mid-70s, leaving the land and the water a post-apocalyptic legal multi-million-dollar nightmare. In Bill Moyer's 2002 PBS documentary, America's First River, shoreline educator, Hudson River Foundation member Chris Letts said, quote, "There are people who still believe that if you fall into the Hudson River, your limbs are going to start detaching themselves from your body, and you're going to develop scrofula, and that you are surely a goner." And the residents of Hastings-on-Hudson have been debating what to do about that ever since. So what's so bad about PCBs in the river? Why all the fuss? Why can't we just build a dock right now and go for a swim? Well, to find out more, I asked a professional, but not just any professional. My friend, Ken. But he's not just my friend Ken. I mean, he really knows about this stuff. He's a doctor who specializes in anthropogenic diseases. And his real title is
Division Chief of Occupational and Environmental Medicine for the North Shore LIJ Health System and the North Shore LIJ Hofstra School of Medicine.
Wait, say it again?
Division Chief of Occupational and Environmental Medicine for the North Shore LIJ Health System and the North Shore LIJ Hofstra School of Medicine.
Right. See, he's the guy you go to when no one else knows what the hell is wrong with you. He's one of the good guys, fighting for the little guy against major corporations that don't want to take responsibility for making their workers sick. He wrote the book on this stuff. Well, actually, 2 books. And wouldn't you know it, he knows all about PCBs. Hey Ken, thanks so much for being here. We already spoke about how PCBs are man-made organics, they're persistent, why Anaconda was using them and that they're banned. We laughed, we cried, it was all very emotional. What I really want to know is where are PCBs in the world and how would they get into the water?
Well, PCBs are everywhere. And in fact, at this point, it's pretty much understood that there is nowhere on Earth where PCBs aren't found. They find their way throughout the Earth a couple of ways. One is that they will end up in the waterways and ultimately into the ocean currents. They will also end up in the atmosphere, absorbed to dust particles, and so they will be brought various places on the Earth through atmospheric conditions. Others will settle into the mud and the sediment at the bottom of the rivers and along the embankments, and they will become, it stores there, and so it becomes a new source for PCBs. In other words, if you've got a highly contaminated soil at the bottom of the river, those will slowly over time, slowly and steadily leach out into the water, and so it maintains reasonably constant levels of PCBs as a result of having now this contaminated sediment. Now obviously it functions somewhat like a gradient. The closer you are to the origin of the source of PCBs, the higher the concentration. And just to be clear, the only way that PCBs exist is through human processes. It doesn't occur naturally. We know there are others. We know, for example, that along the banks of the Hudson River, it can get into the soil. That we know trees can take up PCBs that are in the soil and in the water that they're taking in through their roots. So it can be in trees, and tree bark samples are a common way to demonstrate that. And it can be in the soil, and so as the soil dries and it gets dusty, that dust can be blown through natural conditions to a variety of places locally. And while those exposures would tend to be fairly low, it's very possible and is the case sometimes that those levels do reach high enough points where they can pose health risks.
Oh boy, here come the health risks. But if we look at the wildlife in the Hudson, we begin to really worry about them, don't we? I mean, who's feeding and mating on the bottom or swimming through these leaching areas? Who's crawling around on the contaminated sediment, picking at things to eat while consuming PCBs all along? I mean, what kind of health risks are we talking about? Impaired reproductive, impaired endocrine function, impaired immune system, increased lesions, tumors, and death. Oh! But what about the short-nosed sturgeon? I mean, he's endangered, for crying out loud. Well, we don't know if PCBs are affecting him that badly, but the DEC is going to find out. And we do know they are bottom feeders, so they are exposed and consuming PCBs. They do live in the Hudson their entire lives, which is upwards of 60 years sometimes, and they're not exposed to other freshwater sources because they stay in the Hudson the whole time. But wait a minute, stop the bus. Something just occurred to me. What about humans eating the fish and then being exposed to PCBs themselves?
That's right. And in fact, the New York State Department of Health has regularly issues warnings to people who fish in the Hudson River to be careful about consumption of that fish, because these fish tend to have extremely high levels of PCBs that can pose health issues, particularly for vulnerable populations such as pregnant women, young children. Sometimes it's inhaled, sometimes it's ingested, depends on the situation. Exposed to high levels would have things like liver damage. They could have something called chloracne, which is sort of what it sounds like. It's very severe, thick, dark, scaly acne that can cover parts of the face and the body. That's sort of the classic finding in very high level exposures and poisonings. But the liver effect occurs both at high levels and at lower levels. As you get into lower levels or long-term exposure like a worker may have, then you start to get into a variety of different cancers that can result from those kinds of exposures, as well as non-cancers, thyroid disease. It can also contribute to heart disease, cardiovascular disease, strokes, heart attacks, diabetes. Pretty much every organ system in the body can be harmed by PCB exposure.
Well, that is just awesome. That poor guy. Did you see his face? All because of PCBs. Or the poor endangered short-nosed sturgeon. I mean, the jury's still out on him. He's just trying to get something to eat. Well, what we learned today is that PCBs are horrifying and we need to clean them up as quickly as possible. And I'm happy to report this process is actually already happening. Well, how does it happen? Dredge, dredge, dredge. Luckily, in 2002, the EPA declared the Hudson a Superfund site, clearing the way for targeted environmental dredging of over 2.65 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment. That's a lot of mud. Since Anaconda wasn't the only player here, multiple companies and agencies have come together to try to make this right. So what do? They basically scoop it up, load it onto barges, float it up the Hudson to a place called Fort Edward, which is really ironic because that's where all this mess started with GE's first contaminated site. And then they squeeze the PCBs out of the water, they return it to a potable condition, dump the water back into the Hudson, load the contaminants on trains so they can be transported to an undisclosed location somewhere in Texas and put into landfills forevermore. But who's going to clean up Hastings? Wouldn't you know it? Of all people, British Petroleum. You remember them? Yeah, them. So they're dying to show the good investors, I mean people of this country, that BP cares about the environment. Luckily, they've already jumped on that train and charged one of their companies, Atlantic Richfield, to clear buildings and get down to the nitty-gritty, as they say. Long way to go, though. Building 52 is where all those PCBs were processed, and an assessment clearly shows this is definitely ground zero. But it's started. And this is hope for the people of Hastings. Hopefully, a conversation that will one day be ancient history. And perhaps it'll be told by a father to a son sitting on a park bench on one of the greatest rivers in the world, the mighty Hudson.